All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday morning. First off, my name is Michelle Luevno. I'm the project director for the Minority Women's Enterprise Diversity Center that is operated by the El Paso Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. It is my deep pleasure to welcome Mr. Roberto Coronado from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas El Paso branch as our special guest speaker for this morning to give us a national and regional economic update. We know that a lot of things have been happening in our economy due to COVID-19. So we want to make sure to provide you with an update to look at what that economic impact is starting to look like for our community. Before we actually get started, of course, I do want to go over some housekeeping. First of all, if you are tuning in with us via Zoom, there's going to be a couple of ways that you can ask questions. First of all, you can ask questions via the question and answer panel on the bottom of your screen. The other option, of course, is to go ahead and raise your hand and ask your question live if you're feeling particularly brave at the end of our presentation. If you're tuning in with us on our live stream, the other option, of course, is to go ahead and submit a question via the comment section, and we will answer it at the end live on the air. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Roberto Coronado, the Senior Vice President in charge and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas El Paso branch. Roberto, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. As Michelle alluded to, my plan today is to provide you with an economic update, both at the national and regional level. And by regional level, what we mean is Texas and, of course, El Paso. But before I start, I would like to thank the El Paso Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for inviting us and, quite frankly, to be a pretty strong and strategic partner for many years. That we've worked as the Dallas Fed, we've worked closely with Cindy and her team for many years, and we're very appreciative of the partnership we've built with you, Michelle, and with the entire chamber team. And then also, I would like to thank and acknowledge my team that put a lot of effort along with you, Michelle, over the last number of days in trying to get this organized. Keaton Allen produced all of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But then the outreach team, Molly Flores, Ruben Ajedo, Pope Irawu, and as well as our Dallas Fed team, Stephen Clayton. This is, quite frankly, we're learning with the Dallas Fed. We're learning how to do virtual outreach and how to do it effectively. And so we will welcome your feedback at the end of the session in any way that you think we can improve our programming today. So the usual disclaimer applies, that everything that I'm about to say only reflects my opinions and my views and not necessarily those of the Dallas Fed or the Federal Reserve System. This is a roadmap of what I'm planning on doing today. And quite frankly, if I lose you in the next 20 to 25 minutes, this is the punchline of the message that I have for you today. When we think about COVID-19 and the spread of COVID-19 over the last number of weeks, we've seen that it's very unpredictable. It's very hard to see what's ahead of the curve, and therefore has created a lot of uncertainty, not only for public elected officials, for government officials, but for business owners, business leaders like yourselves, and of course, for all of us as individuals and as consumers. No doubt that the US economy is going through some difficult times as we speak. The second quarter is probably going to see a substantial contraction of economic activity, and I'll show you a number of pictures along the way here. But we expect in the second half of this year, in third quarter, fourth quarter, for the economy to rebound and start growing again. For Texas, this is going to be a difficult year. We expect we traditionally in Texas grow faster than the US economy, but we expect this year not to be the case. There's a number of things playing against Texas, but at the front of the list, of course, is the oil markets and energy prices that we've seen over the past few weeks. When it comes to the local economy here in El Paso, we expect to see substantial, headwinds from the U.S. economy, from Texas economy, but also from across the border and into Ciudad Juarez and into the state of Chihuahua. So let me begin with the U.S. economy. In this chart, what I'm trying to show is GDP growth. GDP is the broadest measure of economic activity we have for the United States, which is all the sum of goods and services produced within the US. In 2019, we had a pretty solid year. The economy grew roughly at about 2.5%, 2.3% to be precise, the numbers we have today. And we began 2020 on a solid footing. However, as we saw the COVID-19 beginning to spread into February, March, we began to see economic activity slow down substantially. And the last reading we have for the economy as far as GDP is concerned is the first quarter of 2020. And as you can see on the far left of your chart, of your screen, this is overall GDP growth, which actually contracted close to 5%, which is a substantial contraction. The bulk of it came from the second set of bars, which is PCE, which is personal consumption expenditures. All of us consumers, we represent about 2/3 of US economic activity. And as we are pulling back from consuming, we've really brought GDP growth down substantially. And then you see the other breakdown of the different sectors in there that are alluded to. But for the most part, the bulk of the contraction is both on business fixed investment and for the most part is personal consumption expenditures. Of course, GDP, one of the drawbacks of GDP is that it's quarterly and therefore it's lags substantially in how we get those readings of the US economy. At the Dallas Fed, some of my colleagues have developed weekly economic indicators to track to see how the economy is doing on a weekly basis. In fact, we're able to update this number or this indicator twice a week. And this is what we see in red. In blue, we see GDP growth, the similar chart that I showed you before. In red, we see the weekly update. And you can see that we saw a substantial decline in economic activity at the national level in the magnitude of 12%. And that's what we've seen so far. At the end of the day, you know, the consumer, you and I are very important drivers of economic activity. And this is looking at retail sales. And as you can see in March, which is the last data we have at the end of this week, we're gonna get April numbers. And in March, we saw a contraction of retail sales at about 8.5%. And then inside the chart, you see a number of different categories. Some of those are durable goods, such as motor vehicles, furniture. Some of them are non-durable goods, such as clothing or food services. And you see a substantial decline across the spectrum there. And that's clearly because of some of the social distancing and some of the policies we have implemented to cope with and try to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. When we think about the social distancing, this chart shows a number of different snapshots at looking at cell phone data, GPS data across the US. And basically the bottom line is that we saw in the first half of March, a substantial contraction in people moving around our economy as we were moving into stay-at-home places, shelter-in-place type of approaches, and we saw, you know, social distancing to take a hit on this. And the peak of most of these numbers are sometime in middle of April. After April 11, to be precise, we've seen a gradual decline, a small decline, still high in levels. And this tells us that it is likely that consumption, it is likely that you and I are still probably staying at home and therefore not consuming a lot of goods and services, and therefore continue to have a decline in economic activity in the US. Last Friday we got the payroll numbers for the month of April, I'm sorry, and it was a substantial decline. 20.5 million jobs lost in April in the U.S. March was tough, about 187,000 jobs lost, but April came a very strong decline in payroll numbers. And about a third of those are in the leisure and hospitality industry, meaning when you think about restaurants, when you think about movie theaters, when you think about entertainment facilities, hotels, and of course, all of those at this point are not seeing traffic at all in many cases, and therefore we saw a substantial decline. Because of the decline in payroll numbers, the unemployment rate rose substantially to roughly 15%. In April, and so that's a substantial increase, which actually is much higher than what we saw during the Great Recession in the 2008-2009 timeframe. Looking at unemployment insurance claims, you can see here on a historical basis going back to the 1970s to today, there's no comparison whatsoever in the last 40 years or so as the number of volume of unemployment insurance claims. And in this chart embedded within the long time series, you see on a weekly basis, they're still very elevated, but we've seen them decline into a range of maybe 3.5 million claims per newly claims per week, and we expect the numbers for this week to be released on Thursday. The unemployment has been hitting across the board, but there's been a lot of concentration in particular industries, those industries who are more prone to the social distancing measures that we've implemented. And here you can see in blue, the unemployment rate by sector back in about a year ago and today. And you can see that, for example, on the far left, leisure and hospitality, a year ago, we had an unemployment rate of 4.5%. Today is close to 40%. You see retail trade, you see construction, transportation, warehousing, healthcare. I mean, it's a whole set of spectrum of sectors, but quite frankly, concentrating again in those sectors that are very prone to the social distancing. One of the things that we've also seen is a substantial decline in consumer confidence. At the end of the day, like I mentioned before, consumers, we make 2/3 of US economic activity. And based on what we see out there in the economy and the prospects from a public health perspective as well, we are not very optimistic about what we see out there, and therefore consumer confidence has declined substantially. And this is gonna take some time before we feel more comfortable on the prospects for the economy. And this is probably gonna be also a source of drag for economic growth in the coming weeks and the coming months. I will be remiss as a central banker if I don't show you a chart of inflation. And there's two main takeaways from this chart. Doesn't matter at which inflation measure you look at. For the most part, everything that we saw so far, we see that inflation is pretty much hovering around the Fed's target, which is a 2% inflation rate. Which that's the good news. The bad news is that because of all the economic slack that has been created because of the downturn, we expect inflation to soften in the next 6 to 9 months to maybe in the magnitude to 1 to 1.5%. So it is likely that inflation is going to decline here in the near term because again of all this slack that has been created on the production facilities or on the labor market. There's a lot of slack that has been brought in full force, and we expect price pressures to diminish here in the near term. Shifting gears a little bit to the Texas economy. Like I mentioned before, Texas historically grows faster than the US. However, history has also taught us that whenever there's a substantial decline in oil prices, it is likely that Texas grows slower than the US economy. So we expect that to be the case in 2020. There's a number of other things that are playing against Texas as we in the wake of COVID-19. Texas has a lower share of workers that can work from home. And then also we have a larger exposure or what, a higher concentration of those industries that I alluded to at the beginning that are more prone to be impacted in a negative way from the social distancing measures that we've implemented. As a tailwind, the other thing that it's playing in favor of Texas is because unlike other areas in the US, when you think about, the Northeast in particular, those communities are very dependent on mass transit to move workers from home to the workplace. In Texas, we don't have that. So when we're ready to go back and go back into our offices, it is likely that Texas is going to cope a lot better because all of us, or for the most part in Texas, we use our personal vehicles, which provides us a lot more safety and security from a social distancing perspective than mass transit. Looking at payroll numbers or payroll growth for Texas, in here I have in blue 2018, in orange 2019, and in gray is just one reading in 2020, which is March, which is when we start beginning to feel the onset of COVID-19. And you can see that across the board, we've seen a decline, whether at the aggregate level or also at the different sector level. And so clearly suggesting that Texas, like the US, the labor market has turned to the south. This chart tries to show in blue in here, what I have is basically the job growth in Texas minus the US job growth. So meaning when the blue line is above 0 means that Texas is growing faster than the US. And then the gray line is oil prices. And you can see that every time there's a substantial decline in oil prices, we see the blue line turning to the negative territory, meaning that Texas grows slower than than the US economy. And so we expect, based on what we've seen so far in the energy prices and energy markets so far, we expect that to be the case for 2020. In addition, like I mentioned at the beginning, Texas has a stronger concentration of those industries that are most exposed to the social distancing measures that we've implemented: leisure and hospitality, transportation, and there's a whole series of industries. And so we have a higher concentration than the US, and therefore we expect the labor market to be weaker vis-a-vis the US economy. One of my colleagues, Jishen Su, he produced a phenomenal research article on when he looks at who is able to work from home. And he slices the data in from different angles. From a geographic perspective, Texas, his estimates is that only 37% of us can work from home versus 39% in the US. For those of you who might be wondering about what that number looks like for El Paso, it's 30%. So the US is close to 40, Texas 37, El Paso is 30%. But then he also provides different cuts, whether it's by gender, by ethnicity, by income level, by educational level, by city. I'll point to the educational level, and that is key as when we go into the El Paso section, is that the less education you have, the more likely is that you're not able to perform your job from home. And therefore, that's why in El Paso, we have a much lower proportion of our workforce that is able to work from home. And educational attainment, it's playing against us here locally. Looking into the unemployment insurance claims for Texas, like the US, we've seen a substantial growth, and we saw the unemployment rate peak to 4.7% in March. We expect, based on our projections at the Dallas Fed, that the April unemployment rate is likely to be, once the data is released later in the week, is likely to be somewhere in the 13% range or so. Looking at where are the unemployment insurance claims coming from in the state of Texas, it's across the board. But again, it's heavy concentration on those industries that are more prone to the social distancing impact. Looking into some of our business outlook surveys, we have a number of them on energy, small businesses, manufacturing, retail, services. The bottom line is that what we've seen, both from a service sector perspective, which is in blue here, from a manufacturing perspective, which is in red, we've seen a substantial decline in economic activity from our business leaders that are do us the favor of filling in the survey. And we publish this on our website. In fact, we publish all of the comments that we get, which is a lot of anecdotal information, which is very rich information. And I would encourage you to go and check the details of what we're learning from our business leaders. Moving into El Paso. So El Paso, just like I mentioned, Texas has a higher share of concentration of jobs that are prone to social distancing. El Paso has a slightly higher than Texas. So when you just think about the leisure and hospitality, for example, El Paso has close to 12% of our jobs are in that industry, whereas in the US or Texas is about 11%. But the biggest challenge for El Paso, I believe, is the educational attainment. 61% of our employees, workforce, that is folks that are 25 years of age and older, have a high school or lower educational attainment. And vis-a-vis 41% in Texas, 40% or 39% in the US, and that is putting a lot more pressure on people's abilities to perform their work and their job from home. The other thing that we've seen is that the initial unemployment claims in El Paso, we have not seen spike or grow as much as we would expect in them. And we believe it is also because it's a timing effect that people in El Paso, for the most part, need to place those, be making a phone call versus getting online because of the digital divide we have in our community. But we expect as those people are able to have someone answer their phone calls, we expect those to maybe grow a little bit stronger here in the next few weeks. As we've seen, the commercial or the flow of people between Mexico and El Paso and the US, for that matter, has been moved into only essential business. And we've seen the number of crossings in our community decline substantially. Whether you look southbound, northbound, we've seen pretty much a decline of about 30% if breach activity in our community, which again, that has a substantial negative impact for a community like El Paso, which we depend heavily on Mexico, whether it's cross-border manufacturing or cross-border retail. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. When we think about manufacturing activity across the border, which is very substantial, it creates a lot of jobs, not only in northern Mexico, but of course, in communities like El Paso, and for that matter, any other Texas border communities. That's based on our research. And we've seen a decline of manufacturing activity in Mexico as they're also implementing social distancing and staying at home measures, just like we've done here in the US and in Texas. And so that's gonna create a headwind for us here in the local economy. But the other thing to keep in mind is about half of the manufacturing across the border is heavy on or is depending on the automotive sector. And we've seen automotive sales in the US decline substantially from roughly 17 to 17 and a half million units per year to about 11 million units per year. And so the decline in the demand for new vehicles in the US, it is likely to put the brakes, literally the brakes on manufacturing activity in Mexico. And that's likely to have a negative impact for us in El Paso. There's a lot of service businesses in El Paso that supply and support cross-border manufacturing, cross-border trade, and this is likely to be a headwind for us here. Looking into the more retail sector locally, based on our research, we estimate that about 1 in every $8 spent in retail in El Paso comes from the Mexican shopper. And there's a couple of headwinds, substantial headwinds here. One is that traffic is non-existent today because of the closing of the border and because just allowing essential folks to come across the border. Two, once we open the border, the second headwind that we're going to be facing locally is the value of the peso. The value of the peso has declined substantially vis-a-vis the dollar, and therefore the purchasing power of the Mexican consumer has diminished, and therefore it is less likely for them to come and spend their money here in El Paso. And so that's likely an area of softness that we expect in our local economy in the near term. Looking at the payroll numbers for El Paso, we have data for March, unlike the US where we have data for April. We even in March, we already began to see the decline. Of course, the decline was very concentrated in sectors such, like I mentioned before, leisure and hospitality and trade sectors as well, because of what I just talked about. The unemployment rate in March ticked up to 4.7%. But again, once we get new data, we expect the number to grow higher. One of my colleagues, Keaton Allen, she's been doing a lot of nowcasting and looking into high frequency data at the regional level to see if we can get some additional insights as to what would expect as once the data comes in. And she basically, in this chart, what she's trying to show is in black is the actual claims for unemployment insurance in El Paso, and in blue is just taking data from Google Trends. And you can see that the Google Trends are pretty good predictive value for us, and we expect them to, for the most part, trending a little bit down, but we expect them to be elevated in the next few readings that we should be getting for El Paso. So just to conclude and move to the Q&A section here, quite frankly, COVID-19 has been very unprecedented. It's been very difficult to predict, has brought a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty as to for how long are we going to be in this space and what is the depth of the contraction in the economy. And I think those are very, very difficult questions to answer at this point. Very challenging questions for us. Most economists expect the economy to decline sharply in the US in the second quarter as we're living the second quarter as we speak, but most economists expect a rebound in the second half of this year. Like I mentioned during my presentation for Texas and El Paso, we expect the hit to be a little bit larger for the reasons that I alluded to, and than the US economy. And then the last thing I would like to mention to the folks joining us through Zoom and through Facebook is that I would encourage you to visit our website. we are continuously learning and continuously trying to understand the economy, whether it's the global, national, regional economy on a daily basis in the wake of COVID-19. And so as we learn new things, whether it's research and hard data and rigorous analysis, or whether it's anecdotal grassroots information that we collect through our outreach professionals, we are putting that on our website. And I would encourage you to visit our website. As I mentioned before, we are learning how to operate in the virtual space from an outreach perspective. On Thursday of this week, we're going to have our bank president, Rob Kaplan, having a global perspective series with the mayor of Dallas, Eric Johnson. And so I would encourage you to visit our website, check our resources. And like I mentioned at the beginning, please let us know any feedback that you have for us, anything that we can do for you to try to understand the economy. We're here to help, we're here to support you. And with that, Michelle, I'll stop and turn it over to you and see what sort of questions and reactions we get from the group here. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you so much, Roberto, for so much great information. So just to give you all a quick reminder, if you're tuning in with us via Zoom, you can ask your questions two ways. First of all, the question and answer panel located at the bottom of your screen. Second of all, if you've had your coffee this morning and are feeling brave, you can, of course, ask your question live by raising your hand. And we will unmute you. And if you're tuning in with us via the live stream, you can go ahead and ask your question via the comments panel. And our communications director, Patrick Espinosa, is standing by to go ahead and provide us with all of your questions so we can ask those live on the air. So while you were presenting, we did have several questions come in. So I'm just going to go ahead and start off at the top right now. First of all, we have a question coming in from your perspective. What economically are the two things that are keeping you up at night? What is worrying you and causing you to wake up in a cold sweat sometimes?
Yeah, so I would say it's the consumer. And I would say, on the short term, on the near term, is how are people coping with what we are seeing out there? There's, as I show you in the statistics, whether national, regional, there's a lot of folks that are really struggling, being laid off, being furloughed, and therefore, their household finances are being put to a lot of stress. And so there's a lot of concern that I have for that. Then in the medium to long term perspective is once the dust settle from COVID-19, and once we get through the other end of this, the question becomes is this episode gonna change the behavior of the consumer? Are we gonna operate differently? Are we wanna work different? Do we wanna consume different? Do we wanna entertain ourselves differently? And if so, that's going to create a lot of disruption for a lot of industries and a lot of businesses. And the economy, if there's a substantial change in behavior here, it is likely that the economic structure, the economic landscape, it's going to be perhaps substantially different. And what is that going to look like? It is very hard to predict at this time. And it's very hard we can sit here and imagine a lot of different scenarios, but that it is likely that we're going to be doing things differently for a while, and that's going to have implications for the economy.
So a lot of times what we talk about in our region is 3 states, 2 nations, 1 region, 1 community. So what happens in New Mexico, what happens in Juarez, it affects us here in El Paso. So we do have a question asking, how is New Mexico faring compared to Texas?
Yes. So based on what we're seeing in New Mexico, I think the story is perhaps a little bit more challenging for New Mexico for a couple of reasons. One is they are far more dependent on oil than we in Texas are. And because of where we see the energy markets being today, they're likely from a state budget perspective, from an income perspective, from a payroll perspective, are likely going to struggle a lot more than Texas. And so on that aspect, it's going to be a lot more challenging. But then also New Mexico depends heavily on tourism. I'm sorry. And a lot of folks coming into New Mexico to enjoy recreational activities, to travel, to sightseeing, and of course those industries today there's no activity there whatsoever. And the question is, how likely are they to go back online, and when can they go back online? So from a sales tax perspective, from a regional tax collection perspective, it's going to be a lot more challenging. And of course, that has a lot of other implications for businesses and for employees in the state of New Mexico. So my sense is that New Mexico is going to struggle somewhat more than Texas.
So we do have some other questions that are coming in about some of the regional impact that we're seeing. So you mentioned a downturn in the maquila production, but are you seeing some maquiladoras trying to pivot to medical PPE manufacturing? We know there's a huge demand for that right now. So are we seeing those businesses try to pivot their business model right now?
There are some instances in which we've seen that, like you mentioned, in this region, like I said during the presentation, I would say about half of the manufacturing activity in the state of Chihuahua is automotive. Another substantial portion of it is electronics. Whether you think about cell phones, computers, tablets, general household electronics, whether you think about whites, washer, dryers, refrigerators, those sort of things. But there was a growing sector and has been a growing sector on the medical device manufacturing. And so we already had a lot of players in that space that are trying to ramp up activity, and we've seen that substantial growth there. But then we've also seen some uh, manufacturing facilities who have the ability to pivot from whatever it is that they were producing, whether it's textiles, whether it's another different of electronics components, into the PPE and into, say, the ventilators that we've been seeing in the news so much the demand for. So we've seen some business. I think the challenge in there is that in many of those cases, in order to export those products into for U.S. consumption, they have to go through a lot of rigorous approval from the FDA and other government agencies. And what we've heard from context is that, well, they're trying to pivot in those sectors because of the high demand and they want to fulfill that demand. They've been facing a lot of challenges trying to go through the hoops of the regulation and the compliance aspects. So it's going to take them some time to be able to enter that new market. But yes, we've seen that, and we've talked to a number of contacts across the board.
We do have another question coming in about the maquilas. Specifically, what is the shutdown of those maquilas? What is the impact going to be on Juarez? And more specifically, as we start to reopen the border, as commerce starts to flow more freely, we know El Paso depends a lot in our retail sector on shoppers coming in from Juarez. So what impact will those maquila closures have as we start to recover, reopen, and have buyers coming in from Juarez again?
Correct. Yes. So the maquila sector in Ciudad Juarez, or in the state of Chihuahua for that matter, when you think about the formal labor market, those who are under the Social Security coverage in Mexico, I would say in Ciudad Juarez, probably 2/3 of the labor force, the formal labor force in Juarez, is employed within the manufacturing sector. And so clearly has a very, very strong role in this in economy like Juarez, economy that like the state of Chihuahua. And what we've seen over the last few weeks is that, with the exception of essential manufacturing facilities such as the medical device manufacturing, the devices that we were talking about before, everyone else has been asked to basically stop production, send people home because of the stay-at-home orders. As Mexico is, like we are, trying to relax some of those orders to try to start activating the economy, they are bringing some folks back into the manufacturing plants and try to reactivate activity. They're learning how to do that, from a social distancing perspective. But also, I think my sense is that they're also learning how the U.S. economy is going to rebound and what sort of demand would there be for their products. Because at the end of the day, whatever they produce in Juarez is something that has the demand has to come from, for the most part, from the U.S. So it will the U.S. consumer, you and I, will have a strong influence as to what sort of facilities come back online and how quickly they need to do so. In the meantime, no doubt that this is going to have a substantial negative impact for the economy of Juarez. And unlike we in the US, in Mexico, they don't have as strong a social safety nets as we do when you think about unemployment insurance and some of the fiscal policies and some of the monetary policies that have been implemented in the US. Mexico has not been able to do some of those policies, therefore, uh, having a lot more headwinds for the employee and the consumer in Juarez. And as you alluded to, a lot of their disposable income or a portion of that comes into El Paso. And so to the extent they continue to face difficult times in Juarez, we should expect economic activity or retail activity on this side coming from Juarez to be pretty negatively impacted. So yeah, I expect that to be here in the near term.
So we do have a question that has come in about trade agreements. And we know that prior to what happened with the spread of COVID-19, the USMCA was a big topic of discussion, also known as NAFTA 2.0. And as we talk about demand and supply and those chains coming back online, what role will trade agreements really have in our recovery as a region?
I think they can play an important role. And I think the fact that the U.S. and Mexico and Canada have put in place the new trade agreement, the USMCA, that clearly removed a lot of uncertainty coming into COVID and to the pandemic, and so that uncertainty is not there. I think there's two things that I would say we gotta think about when we think about the recovery. Is one is what is the demand and where is the consumer going to be in North America, and therefore that's going to dictate what sort of manufacturing and what sort of trade activities will exist between US, Mexico, or with Canada.
Mhm.
And two, I think because of the global pandemic, a lot of businesses are probably going to go back to the drawing board and recalibrate perhaps and rethink about the global supply chain. And do they want to keep the footprint that they had prior to COVID, post COVID? And if the answer is no, because of what we saw over the last number of weeks, then it is likely that perhaps, and in fact, that's what we've been hearing from some of our contacts, is that there are some people that are fairly bullish on North America that they say, you know what, this global pandemic has put a lot of second thoughts in business leaders, and perhaps they're going to start moving manufacturing activity more into North America and perhaps Texas, perhaps Mexico, perhaps a combination of the three countries. And so,
Mhm.
to the extent that materializes in the medium to long term, that's probably going to be a tailwind for economic recovery. But again, I think the first order of business here is to really deciphering where the US consumer is going to land and what sort of things we're going to be buying and consuming. And that's going to dictate what sort of manufacturing activity takes place across the border.
So, speaking of supply chain, we do have a question coming in. What are the findings of the Federal Reserve in regards to the effect that COVID-19 has had on the supply chain in agriculture?
To be quite frank, we haven't done a lot of research on agriculture, and so I would not be able to comment on it at this point.
So I do want to kind of pivot back and focus more on what is happening on a national and regional level. We've kind of talked about internationally, Juarez, El Paso, New Mexico, but just focusing on the El Paso County and also nationwide. We do have a question coming in about whether or not you believe another stimulus package from the federal government is necessary to start ramping up our economic activity. And if so, what form do you think it needs to take? Does it need to be payments to state and local governments? Should it be direct payments to certain industries that are particularly hard hit and are struggling to come back up? Or should it be direct payments to individuals like we've seen before?
Correct. So, it is hard for me to comment on what, the fiscal policy authorities should be pursuing. But let me tell you what we've seen so far. In the wake of the crisis, it was evident, and we as a central bank learned our lesson fairly well during the global crisis, the Great Recession, I'm sorry, in the 2008, 2009, that taking a bold action, a timely action was absolutely necessary, and that's the approach that the Federal Reserve has taken so far. And if you've seen all the measures from lowering the interest rates enhancing the liquidity facilities, creating liquidity facilities for different aspects of our economy. And quite frankly, because of where COVID has the impacts of COVID, we've been playing a lot into the space of households and businesses, particularly small businesses, to try to help those businesses, you know, weather the crisis that we are facing. And I think the fiscal authorities have done a similar approach. And they, as you know, there's been two waves of fiscal stimulus, quote unquote, from a PPP perspective, the paycheck program perspective. And there's some talks that there could be a third one. But again, it is hard for me to comment on it. I do think that the economy, households, businesses, small businesses in particular, are really struggling and have struggled substantially. And so, you know, support from whether the monetary policy authorities or the fiscal policy authorities is absolutely critical for us to get through this, get through the other end, and then after that, figure out what are the next steps to continue to grow the economy.
So as we talk about, having struggled previously before, our rural areas like Presidio, they were heavily impacted by the devaluation of the peso. And recently, we've seen them start to come back in terms of economic vitality. But now, COVID-19, these issues with the Texas oil and gas industry have hit. So, what have we seen specifically economically in the rural areas and the impact COVID has had there?
Yeah, so with the exception of the agricultural component that you alluded to, that I don't have a lot of insight into it, unfortunately. There are some rural areas in our state that depend heavily on the energy markets and from mineral rights, for example, and other sorts of economic activity around energy markets. And those, of course, will be have been challenged substantially in the recent past. There are some other rural communities, as you alluded to, that depend heavily on the cross-border shopper that comes back and forth from Mexico. And of course, those communities, quite frankly, whether you're rural or urban, you've been impacted. We in El Paso, when you think about other border communities in Texas, if you think about Laredo, half of the retail is due to Mexican shopper. McAllen, it's about a third. In El Paso, it's about 15%. And so doesn't really matter, if you sit along the border region, Texas, Mexico, or the US Mexico border region, based on what we're seeing so far, I mean, those communities are going to be challenged and have been challenged substantially. And I don't expect those challenges and those barriers to be removed in the near term because of what we are seeing with the spread of COVID.
So, focusing on the state of Texas right now, we talked about how it's kind of been a perfect storm economically of issues for Texas, with the Texas oil and gas industry taking a hit and then COVID-19 coming in right after that. So, we do have a question about, will our recovery be slower in Texas despite us actually being one of the first states to start to reopen?
So I think the shape of the recovery will depend, for Texas at least, will depend heavily on, like you mentioned, on the energy markets. But then also, let's not lose sight of in what we've learned through the Great Recession is that as businesses began to come online, we saw a lot of reshuffling of headquarters within our country. And we saw a lot of companies moving into Texas for a number of different reasons. And I think those fundamentals continue to be in place. And so that is likely to be a substantial tailwind for an economy like Texas, that once we get out of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is likely that that trend will continue. People will continue to move into Texas. Businesses will continue to move into Texas. And that is likely to accelerate our recovery. But in the near term, no doubt, how the consumer is feeling, how the energy markets are doing, that's going to dictate how their recovery, what sort of shape of recovery we have in Texas here in the next few months. But I believe that the long-term fundamentals that were strong to begin with for Texas are they're still in place. They have not been removed, and so those are likely to continue to propel growth for Texas in the years to come.
So we've got two final questions for you. First off, at the heart of the issue is a question of how to distribute the soaring economic and fiscal costs associated with the crisis, and then, of course, associated with attempting to help stimulate the economy and help with recovery efforts. So, are there any thoughts on this in terms of how things should be distributed and how we should start really making up what we've done to stimulate the economy?
So I think, at the end of the day, no doubt that the stimulus that have been put in place these are expensive stimulus. I mean, these are substantial. When you see the dollar sign and the quantities attached to the dollar sign, those are substantial zeros that are in there. And so this is going to be an expensive stimulus. I think it's necessary based on what we see. Otherwise, things will be a lot more challenging, more difficult for businesses and households. But at the end of the day, once we get on the other side, then we will have to figure it out how we're going to go about paying and how we're going about covering those costs. I think that's something we'll need to start discussing and debating here in the near term. But I believe right now, where the U.S. economy, where the authorities are, is basically just reacting and responding to the crisis. And those conversations as to how we go about dealing with the aftermath, those probably going to be more in the recovery phase. But no doubt, those are going to have substantial implications for us in the U.S. Likely for many years to come.
So, our final question for you is, a lot of businesses, we are all talking about what is going to be a new normal, moving towards possibly a low touch economy, having more people work from home. Of course, we're going to re examine how people go to school. Maybe online classes is going to be more popular in the future. So, as businesses pivot and change and try to adapt, how is this impacting the Federal Reserve? How is it changing how you maybe measure and report your own work and how you all operate?
Correct. This is something, the Federal Reserve has, we have a lot of business continuity plans for a number of different scenarios. At the end of the day, whereas we provided a number of different essential businesses for the financial institutions, for banks across the U.S. And we've always been open in light of what's been going on. Our operations continue to operate 24/7. But at the same time, we've also adapted and we've also adjusted how we work. So a substantial number of us, those of us who are non-essential staff, are working from home, and we've been doing that, as I was alluding to you, Michelle, before coming online. This is my week number 10 working from home. It's been an adjustment, but I think we've proven ourselves, and I was probably one of those skeptical that I was not sure exactly how working from home was going to look like, how effective it was. Well, the last 10 weeks have really been a very strong lesson learned for me that we can do this. We've been doing this very effectively. We continue to operate and conduct our, essential business areas, I'm sorry, and deliverables for the U.S. economy. And but no doubt, I mean, we're changing the way we do business. I mean, earlier in the year, I was able to give this presentation in person to the group, and today we're through Zoom, and so we're adapting, we're pivoting to what the new reality is for us. But I would say that at the end of the day, I've been very proud of everything that the bank and the Fed, the people, are doing. Just like anyone else in their businesses, crises like this really test our ability, really test our commitment to our mission, to our business. And I've been very proud to see, my entire team, the entire Dallas Fed team, really rising to the occasion and doing a phenomenal job. So I'll say that.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Roberto. And we do have a comment that came in from Cindy. She wants to say, great job as always, very thought provoking and insightful information. First off, of course, we want to thank you for everything that you do on the Federal Reserve and everything that your staff has done in putting this presentation together. It really was great information moving forward as we start trying to find this new normal and as we start focusing on economic recovery and getting back up and running. And of course, I also want to thank you for your leadership on our board of directors. We love having you on the board. We are very lucky to steal at least a couple of hours of your time every single month. So thank you for your service on the chamber board.
You're very welcome. It has been my pleasure, Michelle. Thank you for facilitating the conversation today. I hope it was useful to you and everyone who's joining us on Zoom. And like I said, we're here to help. We're here to serve. Let us know how we can help.
And we will be in touch with you. If you all are looking for the presentation slides, they will be provided to you. We will be sending those out. And also within the next hour, you should be able to find the complete presentation and conversation on YouTube if you want to revisit any of the points that Dr. Coronado made. Thank you again so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And good luck working from home and teaching kids at the same time. I know it can be I'm sure it can be challenging.
It's fun. It's challenging, but fun.
Thank you so much. And that will be it for us today. And we will see you on our next webinar tomorrow morning. Make sure to check in with us on Facebook for more information about that. Thank you for joining, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.